Washington managing editor Catherine Falders and transportation reporter Sam Sweeney joining me now for more. So, Catherine, a judge says that Trump's attempt to suspend SNAP is unlawful. What more? He didn't mention anything about it there on the tarmac, but what more do we know?
Yeah, that is interesting. We're referring, and this is just in from, by the way, our colleague Peter Charalambos, who was reading through this ruling. This was a hearing that was heard yesterday on an emergency basis to try and get a judge to restore those funds that will be lost, Kira, as you say, at midnight. So this federal judge in Boston did rule that the administration's attempt to suspend the SNAP funding, as you mentioned, is unlawful, but that judge declined to issue an immediate order.
All right, so picture this. It's Thursday morning. The Capitol is already a mess because of the government shutdown. Everyone's arguing about who's to blame. Federal workers are freaking out about their next paycheck. And then boom, a federal judge just dropped a ruling that sent the entire building into absolute chaos. We're talking about a decision that directly challenges Trump. Like this isn't some minor procedural thing. This is a judge stepping in and saying, no, you can't do that to the President of the United States. And yeah, the fallout has been insane. Here's what happened. Trump's administration had this plan. They wanted to lay off thousands of federal workers, just cut them loose during a government shutdown. When people are already panicking about money and jobs, the timing alone is wild, right? But then a federal judge named Susan Ilston looked at this whole thing and basically said, hold up, this smells political. And that's where everything exploded. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Ordering that the program be funded by the federal government. So while the judge says it's unlawful, that does not mean that all of a sudden food assistance won't go away for 42 million Americans starting at midnight, as you mentioned. So this is just what the judge said, but it doesn't seem at this point that what this judge in particular said will change anything that will go into effect at midnight tonight. Now, remember, there's also another hearing in Rhode Island before a separate federal judge. So we'll see if that judge says anything different that may happen to affect the outcome of what will happen in less than 24 hours.
Because when a judge accuses a sitting president of having political motivations, that's not small talk. That's a judge saying, I see what you're doing, and I'm shutting it down. The ruling blocked the layoffs, just stopped them cold, and the reaction from both sides has been absolutely nuclear. Trump supporters are furious, like really furious. They're calling Judge Ilston partisan. They're saying the courts are sabotaging the administration. Some are throwing around terms like judicial activism and deep state interference. The anger is real. You can feel it on social media, on talk shows, everywhere. It's this raw frustration that the president they voted for keeps getting blocked by judges they didn't elect. And then on the other side, Democrats are basically doing a victory lap. They're calling this proof that Trump had a vendetta against federal workers. They're saying this shows he's abusing his power. They're using words like authoritarian and reckless. It's become their new talking point for everything. But here's the thing that makes this story so much bigger than just one ruling. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The government is shut down. Services are frozen. Families are worried about SNAP benefits getting cut. Federal employees don't know if they'll have jobs next month. The Capitol is already at each other's throats over shutdown blame. And now you throw a controversial court ruling into that powder keg. Yeah, it's a meltdown. The unions representing these federal workers brought the lawsuit. They argued that laying people off during a shutdown was an abuse of presidential power. And apparently, Judge Ilston agreed. She didn't just side with them, she used pretty strong language about political motivations. That's the kind of phrase that gets quoted everywhere. That's the kind of thing that becomes a soundbite for months. And look, whether you love Trump or hate him, you have to admit this is a massive deal because it raises huge questions. Questions about how much power a president really has. Questions about whether the courts should step in like this. Questions about what happens next if Trump just ignores the ruling. Which, let's be honest, wouldn't be the first time a president has tested the limits of a court order. The timing here is also brutal. We're less than a year out from the next election. Trump's trying to rally his base. He's trying to show strength and control. And then a judge publicly blocks one of his major moves and questions his motivations. That's not just a legal setback. That's a political problem. It's ammunition for his opponents. It's a distraction from his message. It's everything a sitting president doesn't want heading into campaign season. And the workers caught in the middle of this, they're just trying to figure out if they still have jobs. They're real people with mortgages and car payments and kids in school, and they're watching their employment status get turned into a political football while Congress argues and judges issue rulings and everyone points fingers. So yeah, the Capitol is in meltdown mode because this story touches everything. Presidential power, judicial independence, worker rights, shutdown politics, election positioning. It's all colliding at once, and nobody really knows how this ends. Because here's the big question everyone's asking. What happens now? Does Trump comply with the ruling? Does he fight it? Does this go to a higher court? Do Republicans in Congress back him up or distance themselves? Do more judges start issuing similar rulings on other Trump policies? This could be just the beginning of a much bigger fight, and that's what has everyone on edge right now. Okay, so let's actually dig into what's really happening here, because the surface level story, yeah, it's dramatic. Judge blocks Trump, Capitol freaks out, everyone picks sides. But there's so much more going on underneath that. Most people are completely missing. First off, let's talk about Judge Susan Ilston. Who is she? Why does her opinion carry weight? And why are Trump's allies so convinced she's biased? Ilston is a federal district judge. She was appointed back in the 90s. She's been on the bench for decades, and over those years, she's built a reputation for being pretty independent. Sometimes she rules in ways conservatives like, sometimes liberals. She's not some brand new activist judge that just got appointed last year. She's been around. She knows how this works. But here's what's interesting. When Trump's team planned these layoffs, they weren't exactly subtle about it. There were statements, there were memos, there was communication that, well, let's just say it wasn't hard to read between the lines. The unions didn't have to dig very deep to find evidence that this wasn't just about efficiency or budget cuts. It looked targeted, and that's what Judge Ilston focused on. She looked at the evidence and said, yeah, this appears to be politically motivated. Now, does that mean she's right? Does that mean Trump's team actually had a political agenda? That's where it gets messy. Because proving intent is really hard. But apparently, the evidence was strong enough that a federal judge felt comfortable making that call. Think about what that means. A judge looked at the administration's own words and actions and decided there was enough smoke to assume fire. That's not a small accusation. That's a judge saying, I don't buy your justification for this. Now let's talk about the workers themselves. We're not talking about a handful of people here. We're talking thousands of federal employees who were about to get laid off during a government shutdown. And yeah, that timing is absolutely brutal. Because here's how a government shutdown works. Federal workers get furloughed. They're told to stay home. They don't get paid during the shutdown. But historically, Congress has always paid them back once things reopen. It's not great, but at least there's a paycheck coming eventually. But if you get laid off, that's different. That's not furloughed. That's unemployed. That's gone. No back pay. No guaranteed return. Just out. So imagine you're a federal worker. The government shuts down. You're already stressed about bills. You're already wondering how long this will last. And then you hear whispers that your entire position might be eliminated. Not furloughed. Eliminated. That's a whole different level of fear. And the unions representing these workers, they saw this coming. They knew that if they didn't act fast, these layoffs would happen before anyone could stop them. So they rushed to court. They filed an emergency lawsuit, and they argued that this was an abuse of power during a crisis. The legal argument here is actually pretty interesting. The union said that using a shutdown as cover to permanently eliminate positions was not what shutdowns are supposed to be about. Shutdowns are supposed to be temporary funding gaps. They're not supposed to be opportunities to restructure the entire federal workforce. And Judge Ilston apparently agreed with that interpretation. But here's where the politics get really messy. Because Trump supporters argue that he has every right to make these changes. They say the federal government is bloated. They say there are too many unnecessary positions. They say a president should be able to streamline things without unions and judges blocking him at every turn. And look, that's not an unreasonable position. There's definitely debate about how big the federal workforce should be. But the problem is the timing and the messaging. If Trump wanted to make these cuts, there were ways to do it that wouldn't have looked so political. He could have gone through proper channels. He could have done reviews and justifications. He could have worked with Congress on it. But instead, it happened fast, during a shutdown, with language that made it sound like he was targeting specific groups of workers. And that's why the judge stepped in. Because even if the end goal was legitimate, the process looked sketchy. And in law, process matters. You can't just do whatever you want, however you want, even if you're the president. Now let's talk about the bigger picture. Because this ruling doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a pattern. Over the past few months, Trump's administration has been hit with multiple court challenges. Different judges in different districts have blocked different policies, and every time it happens, the same cycle repeats. Trump's team says the courts are overstepping. His opponents say the courts are doing their job, and the public gets more divided. This particular ruling is getting so much attention because it's about jobs, and it's happening during a shutdown. Those are things people can immediately understand and feel. It's not some abstract legal theory, it's real people's livelihoods on the line, and that makes it a perfect political weapon for both sides. Democrats are already using this in their messaging. They're pointing to the ruling as evidence that Trump doesn't care about working families. They're saying he was willing to throw thousands of people out of work during a crisis for political reasons. Whether that's fair or not, well, that's the message they're pushing. And with an election coming, that message matters. Republicans are doing the opposite. They're framing this as judicial overreach. They're saying unelected judges shouldn't be able to block a president from managing the executive branch. They're calling it another example of the system being rigged against Trump, and their base absolutely eats that up. It confirms everything they already believe about courts and the establishment. So you've got two completely different narratives being pushed at the same time, and both of them are getting traction with their respective audiences. That's what makes this such a perfect political storm. It's not just about the ruling itself. It's about what the ruling represents to people. And here's something most coverage is missing. The workers at the center of all this, they're not all on one side politically. Federal workers aren't some monolithic liberal bloc. There are conservative federal employees. There are people who voted for Trump working in these agencies, and they're just as confused and scared as everyone else. Because when you're facing a layoff, your political affiliation doesn't protect you. That's the human element that gets lost in all the partisan screaming. Real people are affected by this. Real families are stressing about it. And while politicians and pundits treat it like a game, those workers are just trying to figure out their next move. The shutdown itself is already causing chaos. SNAP benefits are at risk. Other judges have had to step in and order payments to continue. Services are getting delayed. Agencies are scrambling. And now you throw this layoff drama on top of it. It's layers of crisis stacked on each other. And Trump's response to the ruling has been, well, pretty much what you'd expect. He's not backing down. His team is signaling they might appeal. There are rumors they're looking for ways around the order. Because from his perspective, a judge just told him he can't manage his own administration. And that's not something he's going to accept quietly. But fighting this creates its own problems. Because every day this story stays in the news is another day. Trump's not talking about his policy wins or his agenda. It's another day of bad headlines about chaos and court losses. And with an election approaching, that's time he can't get back. The Capitol reaction has been split exactly along party lines, which, yeah, no surprise there. But what's interesting is how intense the reactions are. This isn't mild disagreement. This is full-throated outrage from both directions. Republicans are calling for investigations into Judge Ilston. Democrats are calling for protections for federal workers. Nobody's looking for middle ground. Everyone's dug into their corner. And that intensity tells you something. This ruling hit a nerve. It touched on fundamental questions about power and fairness and who gets to decide things. Those aren't small questions. Those are the kind of questions that define how our government works. The legal experts weighing in on this are split too. Some say the judge absolutely had the authority to make this call. Others say she overstepped and that personnel decisions are executive branch territory. There's a legitimate legal debate here. It's not cut and dry. And that means wherever this goes next, appeals court, maybe even Supreme Court, it's going to be contentious. All right, so let's break this whole thing down into what actually matters. Because there's a lot of noise around this story, but there are really just a few core points that explain everything. Point 1, presidential power versus judicial oversight. This is the heart of the entire controversy. Trump believes he has the authority to restructure the federal workforce however he sees fit. That's his view of executive power. The courts are saying, not so fast. You need to follow proper procedures, and you can't do things for explicitly political reasons. This is a fundamental tension that's existed in American government forever. But right now, with Trump in office and judges increasingly willing to block him, that tension is at an all-time high. And here's why that matters. If judges can block presidents on stuff like this, it sets a precedent. It means future presidents will face the same scrutiny. It means the courts are willing to step in when they think a president is overreaching. Now, whether you think that's good or bad probably depends on whether you like the current president, but the president itself is huge. It shifts the balance of power. Trump's team argues that this makes it impossible to govern. They say if every decision gets challenged in court and blocked by some judge, how is a president supposed to actually do anything? And look, That's not a crazy argument. Constant legal battles do make it harder to implement policy. But the counter argument is that's by design. The system is supposed to have checks and balances. The courts are supposed to review executive actions. That's literally their job. The Constitution set up 3 branches of government for a reason: executive, legislative, judicial. Each one checks the others. And yeah, that creates friction, that creates delays, that creates frustration for whoever's in power. But it also prevents any one person or branch from having too much control. That's the whole point. So when Trump supporters say the courts are blocking him unfairly, they're kind of missing the bigger picture. The courts are doing exactly what they were designed to do. They're reviewing executive actions and determining if they're legal and constitutional. Sometimes that means letting things proceed. Sometimes that means blocking them. That's how it's supposed to work. But from Trump's perspective, he was elected to make changes, to shake things up, to drain the swamp, as he likes to say. And when judges keep stopping him, it feels like the system is working against the will of the voters. That's a real tension, because voters did choose him, but they also chose a system with checks and balances. You can't have it both ways. Point 2, the political timing of all this. We cannot ignore that this is happening less than a year before an election. Both parties know that. Both parties are calculating how to use this. Trump wants to look strong and in control. This ruling makes him look blocked and challenged. That's a problem for his image. Democrats want to paint him as reckless and authoritarian. This ruling gives them ammunition. That's a win for their narrative. But here's what's really interesting about the timing. Trump could have avoided this. If he wanted to make these workforce changes, he could have started the process months ago. He could have built a case for why these positions were unnecessary. He could have worked with Congress, but instead it happened fast, during a shutdown, which made it look reactive and political. And that's why the judge ruled against him. So in some ways, Trump created his own problem here. By moving too fast and being too obvious about the political nature of it, he gave the courts an easy reason to step in. A more careful approach might have worked, but careful isn't really his style. He likes to move fast, break things, shake up the system, and sometimes that works. Sometimes it backfires. This time, it backfired. The electoral implications are massive. Democrats are going to hammer this in ads. They're going to talk about Trump trying to fire federal workers during a crisis. They're going to use it to paint him as cruel and power-hungry. Whether voters buy that message, we'll see, but it's definitely going to be a talking point. Republicans will counter by talking about bloated government and necessary reforms. They'll frame Trump as the guy willing to make tough decisions that career politicians avoid. They'll say the courts are part of the swamp he's trying to drain, and their voters will probably buy that message too. So both sides get something out of this. Both sides get to reinforce their preferred narrative. And the actual truth, the complicated reality of what happened and why that gets lost in the political messaging war. Point 3, what this means for federal workers going forward. Right now, those layoffs are blocked. The workers keep their jobs. But this isn't over. Trump's team is going to appeal. They're going to keep fighting this. And that means these workers are stuck in limbo. They don't know if the ruling will hold. They don't know if a higher court will reverse it. They're just waiting. And that uncertainty is almost worse than a clear answer. Because you can't plan when you don't know if you'll have a job next month. You can't make decisions about your life. You're just stuck. You can't commit to a new lease or a car loan or any major expense because what if you lose your income? That's psychological torture. The unions are celebrating this ruling. Obviously, they see it as a major victory, but they also know it's temporary. They know the fight continues, and they're already preparing for the next legal battle. Because if this goes to an appeals court, they'll need to defend the ruling all over again. They'll need lawyers, resources, time, and all of that takes energy away from other issues they could be fighting for. Meanwhile, morale among federal workers is at an all-time low. Even the ones who aren't directly affected by this ruling are watching and thinking, am I next? When you work for the government, you used to feel like you had job security. That was one of the trade-offs. Government jobs don't always pay as much as private sector, but they're stable, except now, they're not. Now every new administration brings uncertainty. Every policy shift brings fear. That's a fundamental change in what it means to be a federal employee, and recruitment is going to suffer because of this. Who wants to sign up for a federal job when you might get laid off for political reasons during a shutdown? Young people looking at career options are paying attention. They're seeing this chaos. They're seeing the instability. And they're thinking, maybe I'll go work somewhere else. That has long-term consequences for the quality and effectiveness of government. Point 4. The broader implications for Trump's second term. This is the big one. Because this ruling is part of a larger pattern. Trump keeps running into legal obstacles. Judges keep blocking his policies. And every time it happens, it reinforces this narrative that he's constantly fighting the system. Now his supporters see that as proof the system is corrupt. His opponents see it as proof he's overreaching. But either way, it's becoming a defining feature of his presidency, and that has consequences. Because a president who's constantly tied up in legal battles can't focus as much on policy, can't focus as much on governing, can't focus as much on building support for the next election. It's a distraction, a constant drain on time and energy and political capital. Every hour his legal team spends on this case is an hour not spent on advancing his agenda. Every news cycle, dominated by court losses, is a news cycle where his message doesn't break through. Every dollar spent on legal fees is a dollar that can't go toward other priorities. This stuff adds up. The question is whether Trump can turn that into an advantage. Can he use these court battles to energize his base? Can he frame himself as the outsider fighting the establishment? Maybe. He's done it before. But at some point, constant losses in court start to look like weakness, not strength. And that's a dangerous perception heading into an election. His base loves the fighter image. They love that he doesn't back down. They love that he's willing to take on judges and bureaucrats and anyone who stands in his way. But independent voters, swing voters, they might see all these legal battles and think this guy creates too much chaos. That's the risk. That's what keeps his advisors up at night. So what happens next? Well, the appeal process starts. Trump's legal team will argue that Judge Ilston overstepped. They'll say the president has broad authority over the executive branch. They'll push back on the political motivation finding, and they'll ask a higher court to reverse the ruling. The unions will defend the decision. They'll argue that the evidence of political motivation was clear. They'll say the judge was right to protect workers from arbitrary layoffs during a crisis. They'll try to keep the ruling in place, and they'll file briefs and present arguments and do everything they can to win at the next level. This could go all the way to the Supreme Court. Seriously, if the appeals court upholds the ruling, Trump might push it higher. And if it gets to the Supreme Court, you're talking about a major decision on presidential power. That would have implications for decades. That would define the boundaries of executive authority in a way that affects every future president. Meanwhile, the shutdown continues, the Capitol remains dysfunctional, federal workers stay in limbo, and both parties keep using this story to attack each other, because that's where we are now. Every issue becomes a weapon, every ruling becomes a talking point, every controversy gets maximized for political gain. And the workers? They're still caught in the middle, still wondering if they'll have jobs, still stressed about bills and families and futures, because while everyone else treats this like a political game, they're living with the real consequences. They're the ones who can't sleep at night. They're the ones having tough conversations with their spouses about backup plans. They're the ones whose lives are actually on the line here. Here's the bottom line. This ruling matters because it shows the courts are willing to directly challenge Trump on major decisions. It matters because it affects thousands of real people's lives. It matters because it's happening during an already chaotic shutdown. And it matters because both parties see it as a perfect weapon for the coming election. Will it change anything long term? Hard to say. Court rulings get overturned. Policies get revised. New approaches get tried. But in the moment, right now, this is a huge deal. The Capitol is melting down over it. The political world is obsessed with it. And the fallout is just getting started. Because this isn't just about one judge's ruling on one policy. This is about power. About who has it, who can check it, and what happens when those forces collide. And right now, those forces are colliding hard. The stakes couldn't be higher. The divisions couldn't be deeper. And the resolution couldn't be less clear. So keep watching this story, because something tells me this is nowhere close to over. The appeals are coming. The political attacks are coming. More court battles are probably coming. And through it all, federal workers are just hoping someone remembers they're actual people, not political props. That's the real story here. Power struggles at the top, real consequences at the bottom, and a Capitol that can't figure out how to function anymore. Democracy is messy. It's complicated. It's frustrating. But it's also what separates us from authoritarian systems where one person makes all the decisions without any check on their power. More on this as it develops, because trust me, it's going to develop. This story has legs, and we're just getting started.